Alors, nous sommes le Subcommittee des
This is the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today it is the 11th of June. This is meeting number 87.
Good behavior that apply for televised sessions apply today. With us as a witness today, we have Jocelyn Kelly, who is the director of the Women in War program at Harvard University. And I'll just mention that what we're doing here is we're returning to a study we looked at some time ago. It's our first hearing in quite a while into the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and specifically the use of sexual violence against women being used systematically as a weapon of war. Ms. Kelly, we're very glad to have you here today. I know that the clerk will already have explained the general outlines of how these things work. You have as much time as you need for your presentation, but we usually encourage people to stay around the 10-minute mark. The amount of time we have left when you're finished will determine how much time we have for each of the 6 rounds of questions and answers you'll get from the members of the subcommittee. Please feel free to begin any time. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank the subcommittee for this opportunity to address you on the issue of sexual violence against women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. My name is Jocelyn Kelly, and I'm the director of the Women in War program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary research group at Harvard University that examines how to bring evidence-based practices into complex crises. I've seen the transcripts of the other substantive sessions on Congo, and I know the members of the subcommittee are already very knowledgeable about the situation there. It's a rare honor to be invited here today to speak about such an important issue, and to those who are so clearly committed to this problem. I've worked in international crises and disaster response since 2004, and have specifically worked in DRC since 2007 as a public health researcher, using both quantitative and qualitative research methods. During my time there, I've worked not only with survivors of sexual violence, but also with current rebel combatants from a number of groups, and with demobilized former soldiers, including former child soldiers. This has provided me an unusual opportunity to look at the complex issues in DRC from many angles. The work of the Women in War program has been possible because of the close partnerships we have with local organizations who undertake heroic work, including Panzi Hospital, the Centre d'Assistance Médico-Psychosociale known as CAMPS, and the Eastern Congo Initiative, to name but a few. Our program is committed to looking at gendered issues in areas of political instability. We try to conduct action-based research with local partners in an effort to inform programming and policy using the voices and recommendations of the true experts in a situation, those who are themselves affected. In DRC, our most recent projects have focused on a number of topics, including mitigating the stigma that survivors of sexual violence face in their families and communities after rape, the issues faced by children born as a result of sexual violence, the demobilization and reintegration of former child soldiers, and human rights assessments with a particular focus on women's rights in artisanal mining towns. I know we cannot even begin to cover all of the results from all of these projects. So instead, I'd like to try and cover 2 broad points in this presentation. I'll try and synthesize our more detailed research results into a set of more general observations about the situation in DRC, especially as it relates to women's issues. And next, I'll try to propose a set of recommendations, again, supported by those affected by these issues, in the hope that this will help the committee in its work. So we're here to discuss sexual violence against women used systematically as a weapon of war in DRC. To do this, I'd like to start with one of my favorite quotes from feminist Gloria Steinem. At a presentation of hers I attended a few years ago, she said, "When we discuss women's issues, we call it culture. And when we discuss men's issues, we call it economics." The committee has already recognized what many people still struggle to realize, that sexual violence and conflict anywhere is not just a women's issue, it's not just a cultural issue. It's a political issue, a human rights issue, and it's at the core of the peace and security agenda. The DRC conflict can be intimidating to understand. People can get lost in an alphabet soup of factions of armed groups and subgroups and shifting political and military loyalties. It's a complicated situation, but there are lessons that have emerged through our work and the work of many dedicated researchers. First, and perhaps very obviously, wounds resulting from sexual and gender-based violence are multidimensional in scope. This pervasive and often public violence affects not only the individual survivor, but also shatters family and community relationships. The stigmatization and isolation of survivors from their social networks, the witnessing of public sexual violence by members of a survivor's family and community, and the changes in social norms because of displacement are all destabilizing effects of sexual violence on communities. A complicated problem requires a holistic approach. It is important to provide integrated medical, mental health, and economic support services. Holistic care, either through referral mechanisms or integrating different services in the same organization, is required in order to address this issue. Second, people focus on the problems that women of Congo face. But interestingly enough, many of the women we speak to are most concerned about their children and their families. We must take an integrated, family-based approach to addressing this problem. Children are especially reliant on a myriad of critical social structures, family, religious communities, education, and health systems in order to ensure their health and development. But these are the very systems that have been undermined or destroyed as a result of the pervasive insecurity in DRC. Children are affected both directly and indirectly by sexual violence. Services must take a family-centered approach to help women address not only their personal needs resulting from rape, but the needs of their families, including children as well. The Congolese government has made a commitment to ensure free education for children up to primary school. It's a promise that has currently been unmet. You would be surprised by the number of women who have suffered life-threatening injuries, have had everything that they own taken away from them. And when you ask them what they would like to see change in the future, the one thing they ask for is education for their children. Another result is that the conflict has resulted in deep destabilization of economic systems. We must provide context-appropriate income-generating solutions for women and men. We must encourage community-led implementation of farming and trade cooperatives and micro-lending. And we must provide security for the women who are ready to work to undertake the activities that they choose. Our work with the World Bank in artisanal mining towns in DRC illustrates the importance of this issue. Women often go to mining towns to seek economic opportunity that is all too rare in Congo. There they face horrific outcomes and are often marginalized into undertaking sex work instead of fulfilling their right to undertake fair paying work in mining towns. There's a need to support local mining activities in a sustainable way to harness the economic promise in these areas. To do so, we must address corruption and fraud in the mining sector, provide technical assistance to the modernization of artisanal mining, engage in education around Congolese law and the mining code, and promote grassroots inclusive economic cooperatives. Finally, violence is cyclical. I've interviewed more than 100 soldiers from a number of rebel groups during my time in Congo. We think of combatants as perpetrators of violence who commit monstrous acts that most of us find impossible to understand. However, many of these soldiers were forced to join armed groups through kidnapping or intense pressure, and they often joined at very young ages. Many soldiers joined with the idea of fighting against the atrocities committed against themselves and their families. But after joining, these men and women found themselves perpetrating the same crimes that they themselves had suffered. We see a recurring pattern to the insecurity in DRC. Many of the rebel soldiers we have talked to have gone through a revolving door of demobilization, undergoing this process multiple times. When I was in DRC last summer, our research was interrupted as we were interviewing former child soldiers who were actually leaving our research project in order to rejoin the fighting against M23. Since the conflict is now 2 decades long, there's an entire generation of young people who have never experienced peace. Funding for the demobilization of rebel groups and integration of soldiers into their communities must be a part of other services and requires long-term commitments from governments and donors. Combatants need ongoing psychosocial services in addition to simply giving up their guns. I heard a psychologist talk about this as mental disarmament. Undertaking this work will help ensure that military mindsets and predation on civilians does not occur after ostensible peace processes are undertaken. Despite the complexity of the situation in DRC, there are things that we can be sure of. Peace must be a foundation for longer-term sustainable improvements to the situation in Congo. Women's issues are political issues. Sexual violence and other human rights violations undermine peace and security in Congo. Sexual violence and conflict is not inevitable. I'll say it again because it's something that many of us still struggle to understand. We think of rape as old as war itself, yet many remarkable public health and political scientist researchers are undertaking groundbreaking work to show that sexual violence and conflict is not inevitable. Since it is not inevitable, we are charged to address this issue and to prevent it. This can be done through attainable but difficult measures, including changing attitudes around women's rights, through ending impunity for military and civilian perpetrators, through undertaking security sector reform with the national military, through providing fair and equal employment and educational opportunities for women and men, and pursuing for lasting peace and stability in Congo. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the entire committee for your continued dedication to this important issue.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. We're going to begin our questioning with Mr. Sweet. Mr. Sweet, you have a 6-minute round to work with.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Kelly, and your comments after Gloria Steinem's quote. I just want you to know that I'm certain that I speak for my colleagues, that our commitment to violence against women and the nature of that being just as important as violence against men or against children is unequivocal. So you have our commitment in that regard. I wanted to, you'd mentioned the lack of the DRC's fulfilling their promise on free education. So what do you see is their level of commitment right now against sexual violence against women by the Congolese Army? And what more could the international community do to move them in the right direction if that's needed?
Thank you for an incredibly important but difficult question. In terms of the Congolese government's commitment to addressing sexual violence, I think it's a difficult question. I think any commitment is strengthened by sustained pressure from partners who are truly committed to this issue. I think the Congolese government is made up of remarkable individuals, many of whom have personally been affected by the conflict and personally want to address many of these questions. However, I do think political will needs to be strengthened, and I think it needs to be the foundation for addressing this issue, and I would like to see a more sustained and committed effort by the Congolese government. I think that can be promoted by continued pressure from governments like the United States and like Canada.
There's a ways to go.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a multi-part question now. It's important for us and as for our evidence on this study. A new intervention brigade with a mandate to reduce the threat of violence against civilians, including sexual and gender-based violence against children that is posed by Congolese and foreign armed groups, and to neutralize a number of specific armed groups, was created in March 2013 under UN Security Council Resolution 2098. In your view, how is the deployment of the UN's new intervention brigade likely to affect the situation in the eastern DRC? To what extent do you think this new force may be able to contribute to reducing levels of conflict-related sexual violence in the DRC? And do you have any suggestions for the international community regarding ways to improve the likelihood that the intervention brigade will have a positive impact on the security situation in the eastern DRC?
So I think the question addresses the new intervention brigade from the United Nations. As a public health researcher, I sometimes hesitate to comment authoritatively on some of the UN undertakings. However, I would say that many of the interventions that need to be undertaken still need to be integrated with local and national efforts as well. While the UN's efforts in DRC are admirable, I think in many ways, no matter how large the number of troops, it's still an enormous country, and the true effort really does need to come from political will from the Congolese government, and I see that as a more sustainable avenue for changing things on the ground. I think that can be achieved through security sector reform and better payment of salaries and training for Congolese troops.
Do you have any concern that the actions of the intervention force will cause reprisals on innocent people?
I think it would be difficult for me to comment authoritatively on that. We certainly see many unintended consequences as a result of actions in Congo, so I would not rule it out. Okay,
you've been on the ground for a while. One of the other things I wanted to ask you is there a progression? We heard some positive testimony some time ago about the effects of NGO efforts and government efforts to change the culture in regards to how the communities respond to women who are raped and then become pregnant and have children. Is that still progressing? Do you still see positive signs that the broader community are embracing these women rather than what was happening before and shunning them, even though they weren't guilty of anything, they were the victims?
Absolutely. I think that was one of the most troubling and incomprehensible things that we saw occurring in Congo, that women were literally being blamed for a rape that was so clearly not their fault. One of the local partners I mentioned, the Centre d'Assistance Médico-Psychosociale, that works in Bukavu but actually radiates out to some of the most remote areas in Congo, has done kind of heroic work trying to change attitudes, and I know many NGOs are undertaking those efforts. I think we can be happy that we certainly see changes in attitudes and cultural norms around the way that survivors of sexual violence are treated. I also think that when women act as are able to bring income into their families and become vital economic actors in their families and communities, this also really helps them regain a sense of dignity and agency and really helps with their acceptance. And so while we recognize that acceptance should occur no matter what, we also see that income-generating programs, in addition to changing mindsets and cultural norms, can be a very powerful way to address stigma against survivors of sexual violence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Kelly, for coming here today to give us your very eloquent testimony. My first question has to do with NGOs. Some NGOs believe that their cooperation with the United Nations is in fact not in conformity. They are afraid of being denied access to certain regions. Unfortunately, the witness doesn't have her earpiece in, so unfortunately Mr. Jacob will have to start again and have time added to his speaking time, as the chair has just stated. Testing 1, 2, 3. So my first question is that certain NGOs are afraid that their cooperation with the UN is going to be tied with the new response brigade. These NGOs are afraid that they will have access to certain regions denied. A lot of groups believe this UN military brigade will lead to reprisals against humanitarian workers. Do you have any misgivings or fears about the impact that the response brigade might have on humanitarian aid and also the safety of humanitarian workers and the population and the populations that they provide service for?
Comment and question. I think, unfortunately, as someone coming more from the research community, I would hesitate to speak on behalf of programmatic NGOs working in the area. And so, unfortunately, I think I should probably leave that question to the programmers who are doing work on the ground every day.
Okay. Merci.
Thank you, I see. My other question is in March 2013, Bosco Ntaganda, a presumed leader of M23, went to the US Embassy in Rwanda and was charged with criminal actions before the International Criminal Court. In your opinion, what led Bosco Ntaganda to going to the US Embassy to attend a trial before the International Court, and what will be the impact with respect to his accountability with the M21 group?
An important question. I would once again hesitate to comment on the motivations leading up to going to the American Embassy. So I apologize, but I think I'm going to go ahead and stay within my area of expertise, which is the impact of sexual violence on survivors in Congo.
Donc, je vais vous poser une question.
So I'll ask you an easier question. Do you have any suggestions that the government of Canada might take in order to prevent and contain sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Any advice to the Republic of Congo?
Thank you for that question. I certainly do find that a bit easier to respond to, although naturally it's a difficult question as well. I think Canada has undertaken a remarkable commitment to working in DRC, and I congratulate you on your efforts through CEDA. I think one of the things that we've seen in DRC that is not necessarily a reflection of Canada, but of funding mechanisms in general, is that NGOs, local organizations, and even multilateral organizations struggle with the fact that they're trying to undertake long-term, sustained efforts, but funding often comes in fits and starts, and attention varies between different efforts at different times. And so one of the challenges, for instance, in demobilization and reintegration efforts was that funding would come in 6-month cycles, but clearly soldiers needed much longer-term services in order to be able to fully reintegrate into civilian life after spending sometimes decades in armed groups. And so what I would say is that Canada can lead not only by example, but also by supporting a kind of sustained multi-donor mechanisms that can create funding that is targeted to important questions, that lasts, for many years instead of in short funding cycles that create disruption of services. Another thing that I would say is very unique to this setting is I think Canada has the opportunity to create political pressure on the Congolese government to fulfill some of its promises and to continue to push for political solutions to sustained problems.
Il me reste encore un peu de temps.
Do I have any time left? Yes. Your association, has it conducted research on the motivations of combatants to commit acts of sexual violence in the eastern regions of the Democratic Republic of Congo? Do you have suggestions about the mechanisms that former militia members have become integrated to the Congolese army? How that occurred?
One of the projects that we have undertaken is looking specifically at the experiences, attitudes, and motivations of non-state combatants, including especially the Mai Mai militia. We found that there's a number of practices within armed groups that promote the practice of sexual violence against civilians. One is the depersonalization of combatants. So they often go sustained and very violent initiation into armed groups that leads to this sense of kind of dehumanization. Another thing that we've seen is this attitude that civilians are there to be preyed upon. So one quote that we often heard from soldiers is, civilians are fields to be harvested. And there's this sense that if soldiers have given up so much to take up arms to protect Congo, that they have the right to take what they want from civilians. We also see that combatants draw lines among different kinds of human rights abuses. So they still feel like they avoid certain types of rape that they see as especially bad. For instance, rape of the very young or very old, or forced incest. But what that means is by separating rape into evil rape and okay rape, they kind of justify undertaking certain forms of abuses against women and can reconcile that in their own minds. So it's an interesting finding in the sense that we can learn about how soldiers think about sexual violence in some of these subgroups. What I would say is that the work that we undertook was only with certain subgroups of one militia, and as you know, there are many in DRC. I think something that's very true is that there's a varying landscape of motivations for undertaking sexual violence in Congo. Oftentimes it is not an order per se that comes from a military commander, but it is either condoned or people look the other way, or it's looked at as a way for soldiers to it's looked at as a way for soldiers to exert control over civilian populations or to take what they want. And many rebel commanders have no interest in trying to prevent rape amongst their troops. And so this is definitely an area of research that we found interesting and does point to potential intervention points. One is something as simple as saying that all rape is bad rape and that you must change attitudes around the way that combatants look at women. Another is to undertake more effective disarmament and demobilization. Something that I think is very much of concern and many people have talked about in DRC is that when combatant groups are integrated into the National Army, it's poor and incomplete integration. So at one point I was in a town called Walungu and I was talking to what I thought were rebel soldiers, and they identified as part of a rebel group. And at some point I noticed that a number of them were wearing kind of national military issue uniforms. So I asked them about this and they said, oh yeah, that reintegration thing, that happened about a year ago, but at no point did they identify as national military, did they think of themselves that way, and they continued to behave in the way that they had as a non-state armed group. So I think what we see is a deep need for more effective demobilization and reintegration programming, as well as much more effective security sector reform within the Congolese national military. That includes putting soldiers into barracks so they're not always around the civilian population. That includes providing more sustained salary support so soldiers don't have this mindset of I need to take what I can get from civilians because I don't get anything from the government. And it certainly involves an enormous amount of training and attitude change.
Merci, Madame Kelly. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to you, Mr. Jacob.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly, for your time and your presentation. And certainly all of us do appreciate that. Well, as we know that you are the director of the Women in War program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and you spent almost 5 years in the DRC and speaking about combatants and non-state armed groups, about conflict-related sexual violence. In a recent blog posting you wrote, and you talk about how you reflected on the complex process of trying to understand one of the most incomprehensible human behaviors, and can you discuss some of the your experiences and reflections about spending those 5 years there in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Certainly, and I think this again gets to the work with non-state armed combatants, many of whom are perpetrators of the violence that we're trying to understand here today. One thing that struck me as particularly heartbreaking working in DRC is that when you talk to many of these kind of rebel commanders and combatants, you're trying to understand what many of us think of as an entirely incomprehensible behavior, which is very intense abuse of civilians, sexual violence against women that many of us find incredibly difficult even to hear descriptions of. For me, I think the most challenging thing was recognizing that many of these soldiers had actually witnessed and undergone the very violence that they were then propagating. And I think this is one of the most core aspects of the conflict in DRC and one of the most heartbreaking. So again, returning to that question of the cyclicality of violence, we often saw both men and women actually joining armed groups as young girls and boys. And while some of them were kidnapped, some of them faced intense pressure to join, others joined out of a sense of anger or wanting to protect their communities from the violence that their own families had undergone. And so one girl actually very eloquently talked about how she joined a Mai rebel group because she had watched her mother and sister be raped. And so her decision to become a soldier was informed by the fact that she had seen this violence occur in her household, and she wanted to take up arms in order to both take revenge and to protect others from having to undergo this. The most heartbreaking thing is once in an armed group, many soldiers face incredibly horrific and dehumanizing conditions that would challenge our human understanding. And I think that changes people, and there's systematic approaches to creating soldiers who are able to abuse civilians. This gets us back to the question of how to mentally demobilize soldiers who often have no concept of how to live in civilian communities. While we think that taking away guns means disarmament, what we find is that soldiers put back into civilian communities still exhibit the same behaviors that they did while they were combatants, which involves violence, taking what you want, preying on civilians, and this is incredibly destabilizing for communities in DRC. So again, we get back to that question of how do you demobilize the combatants who needed to be demobilized? That's through long-term, sustained psychosocial services that are linked to also economic support. Many combatants find that not only can they not find a job, but they don't actually have the social skills to make it in civilian communities. They simply have not learned those skills. So services need to be geared to providing those capacities. In addition, some soldiers actually do choose to remain soldiers and join the National Army. However, right now that is not always a positive or sustainable option in terms of getting a salary, making money, and behaving like a honorable soldier. What I think is most interesting about speaking to many of these combatants is that there is this sense of, or longing for, honor and discipline and a sense of structure. It's just not something that they are able to achieve in their current situations. And so I think if the Congolese government undertook to create a disciplined, well-paid military, there would be an enormous amount of interest from combatants who have a desire to be in an organization like that. Unfortunately, right now, that's just simply not the case.
Ms. Kelly, in a recent report you wrote called Characterizing Sexual Violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you stated that 1 in 3 women reported being rejected by their husbands, and 1 in 15 report being rejected by their communities after rape, and you continue to say that the stigma they face as survivors of sexual violence can be as traumatic as the attack itself. So can you kind of explain how both sexual violence is detrimental to human rights in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in addition to the emotional effects of sexual violence as well?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for taking the time to read our reports. I would just make a note that those statistics do come from a smaller survey, so that's not necessarily a population-based survey, but those were numbers we found in a smaller clinic-based sample of women who reported experiencing sexual violence. And I do think those numbers are reflective of other organizations who do find that roughly 1 in 3 women face actual social isolation or full-on rejection from their own families as a result of experiencing sexual violence, and a number of other women are actually feel forced to leave their own communities as a result of the negative attitudes towards women who've undergone rape. As you can imagine, this exposes women to dire cycles of vulnerability. Without a family structure, with no way to earn money, and often taking care of children, these women are kind of forced to live on the streets and create a living on their own, which often tragically forces them to turn to transactional sex, or leaves them being passed from hand to hand, from relative to relative, with nowhere to go. One thing that's interesting and shows the linkages between different aspects of this conflict is that sometimes women who are rejected by their families end up in these artisanal mining towns, because it's one of the few places that women can go with the hope or promise of economic opportunity, and a place where many women feel like they don't need families in order to be able to make it. And there we see very much this cycle of vulnerability, where women who do travel to mining towns often have no other option but to engage in transactional sex work instead of being able to undertake other forms of employment. One of the things that women told us is that, as hard as it may be to understand, the stigma can actually be more traumatic than the rape itself, because it has lifelong repercussions, in terms of the fact that in a highly social society where women are often sadly defined by their relationships with men, being expelled from a family or community means that they're left with literally no support structures to rely on. And so I think it was very poignant to hear women talk about that. And again, tying things into some of the other issues that we've talked about, women really saw education, both for themselves and for their children, as a way to lift themselves out of some of these cycles of vulnerability.
Thank you. Chair, do I have some more time?
No, unfortunately you don't. I'll let you go over a little bit there.
Thank you very much.
Professor Cotter, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask a general question about the renewed round of fighting, but I think I'll go to some of the initiatives that the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative has undertaken and has information about, and follows up right at Nina Gruel's question. That is the prevalence of forced marriage amongst women and girls to fight as what has been referred to as bushwives, and the sexual slavery in the DRC. What about the problems of the reintegration of these women and their children as a result of the forced marriage problem?
Thank you for this wonderful question. This is an issue that we've looked at closely and I think is extraordinarily important. What we see hopefully changing as part of the wider women, peace, and security agenda is an understanding that demobilization programs traditionally have been targeted at male combatants, and there was an assumption that women were simply not part of armed groups. We now recognize that that is absolutely not the case, and there are often large numbers of women associated with non-state armed groups all throughout eastern DRC. Many of these women are truly sexual slaves, although some have chosen to join or identify with the armed group that they're in. And as you can imagine, many of these women also have children during their time with armed groups. Often they face dire medical issues upon demobilization. However, we see that DDR programs are simply not geared to address the needs of women, and so often girls simply don't receive the services that men do, that they don't feel safe in the camps created for demobilizing combatants because they don't have anywhere dedicated for them. We see that people don't have the capacity to address the health and reproductive issues that women face as a result of their time in armed groups, and that many women are providers for a number of children when they demobilize. I think one way to address this challenge is to think of ways to create programming that explicitly addresses the needs and experiences of women who've been in these armed groups, both from a health, a psychosocial, and an economic perspective. Currently, that is an enormous gap in programming.
Let me just also, related to the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative's work, there have been increased attacks on human rights defenders who have been engaged in issues of sexual violence. And you also had the failed assassination attempt, the director of the Pansy College, and you've, in fact, been working with them as well. Can you give us some insight into the situation at this point of human rights defenders more generally and attacks upon them?
I think this is an area of enormous concern. As many of you know, Dr. Mukwege, who's the director of Pansy Hospital, is truly, I think, the hero at the forefront of the issue of sexual violence in DRC and has dedicated his life to helping women there. And he did face an assassination attempt recently, and despite that has returned to Congo to continue his work. I think it's a reflection of a deeper problem relating to human rights in DRC. While you have some heroes who undertake work with complete disregard for their personal safety, this is simply not a safe situation for people to work in. And what I think it relates to is the broader issue of the fact that peace and stability must be a foundation for other efforts. I've seen clinics built and schools built and returned months later to find them rubble or washed away or abandoned because of a recent attack. And I think in order for true progress to occur in Congo, we need to think about how to create a relatively sustained peace where people like Dr. Mukwege can undertake their work knowing that they'll wake up the next day and have the ability to continue. And I think, you know, frankly, it probably reflects to some extent a disregard for human rights in certain wider political structures.
Let me just maybe on this point, because it's going to be my original question, but I thought it too broad, but just to take up right now where you left off, you know, because we had renewed fighting in the Congo and a UN Security Council resolution, and then discussions between the government and the rebel, and now purportedly, you know, peace talks and the like. Number one, are women involved in the peace talks and in the peace building process, and what do you see as the prospect for this latest round of prospective peace building attempts?
You know, I always remain hopeful, and I think peace building has a terrible track record in terms of involving women. I think one of the statistics from UN Women is that only 16% of all peace negotiations have involved women at any point. I think this is an opportunity for us to change that. I think with 1325 and 1820 and continuing Security Council resolutions, we are really in an exciting frontier for the women, peace, and security agenda. And I think one of the best ways to demonstrate the commitment to this would be to have women at the forefront of peace negotiations in Congo. I think there's something very, very powerful at knowing that you are going to be accountable to women at the end of a conflict. And so far, that has almost never been the case.
Thank you.
Kotler. Turn now to Mr. Schellenberger, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And excuse my voice, it might go in and off here a little. Peace is essential for a stable country. We all know that. And after decades long, or a couple decades of fighting in the Congo, and if you're in rebel groups and you're not being paid, you only get what you pilfer. And so I can understand that. Is any of the sexual violence against women motivated by religion?
That's such an interesting question, and I would have to say that while there are often very elaborate kind of magical belief systems within subgroups, that almost kind of a mythology that is created as part of being a part of an armed group, in terms of kind of traditional religion, that's not something I'm aware of happening.
Okay, so before the conflict started, you didn't have these rapes, the sexual violence against women, but since the violence has started over the years, this is sexual violence against women has just grown, and it's it seems to me as if it's almost a fight against women.
Mm-hmm.
When you do something like that, they get discharged from their village, or they're divorced by their family. So has there been recent changes? Has it got more prevalent recently or over the years?
Yeah, this is such a powerful observation. I think you're exactly right. And one of the things I've heard other experts in Congo say is that many armed groups try very hard not to fight each other and instead, in a very cowardly way, end up exerting force on civilian populations almost as their way of showing how strong they are. And then, so it truly is a war fought on the battleground of women's bodies and more broadly on civilian communities, rather than through, often it's not direct combat between armed groups. And I think this is one of the saddest and most shocking things about the conflict in DRC.
It's a very cowardly way, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think another point that you made, which is really important, is that we certainly see forms of violence against women that we never saw before the conflict, including public rape or forced incest or rape of the very young or very old. However, I do think it's important to recognize that sexual violence is a continuum. It occurs in peacetime, and it will continue to occur when the conflict ends, and that this is something that we have to keep in mind, that drawing a distinction between conflict-related sexual violence and non-conflict sexual violence is sometimes important, but that in order to truly address the issue of violence against women, we actually have to look at this as a continuum as opposed to kind of a dichotomous issue.
That's my question.
That's it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. That just gives me a chance then to pop in and just ask for a little additional clarification. You mentioned the groups, in some cases, avoid combat with each other and exploit the population, which raises two alternative possibilities in my mind. Perhaps they're both correct, but it would seem to me that either one or the other is. Possibility number one is that these groups are operating a bit like the condottieri of the Italian Renaissance, these groups that could have fought with each other but were actually trying to avoid inciting any casualties and would engage in demonstrations of strength in some other manner. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that these are simply groups of brigands to some degree, or they've started evolving into groups that really don't have a cause except self-perpetuation. What would be the case?
I think both explanations are valid, and I really think that the second explanation rings true. I think after 2 decades of instability, those mechanisms that are successful, that actually work, are often mechanisms of take what you can and take what you can by force while you can. I think it's tragic, but many of the more traditional economic systems have begun to disintegrate as a result of this sustained insecurity. And what has emerged is kind of an adapted system of economic opportunism that involves starting a rebel group. And I think one of the sadder things that I saw on a recent trip to DRC was I was with my Congolese mentor, Justin Kabanga, who's head of this psychosocial assistance organization. We were in a car together on a kind of remote rural road, and 2 7-year-old boys had pulled a string across the road, and we slowed down because they'd created a very, very small roadblock. And we rolled down the window, and one boy asked for money. And I was kind of horrified, because this was seeing a young generation of Congolese boys mimicking what they saw as what men did. And it was really created an interesting conversation with Justin about what kinds of jobs, some children play store, and these boys were actually playing rebel group. I think what people often do is they see the most viable way to make money is to create these semi-politically motivated, but mostly just opportunistic armed groups.
Thank you. Mr. Toon, you were batting cleanup today.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. Glad to be taking up the rear, and thanks for all your presentations. It's been very illuminating. And I apologize for the cavernous nature of the room, but anyway. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit about HIV Certainly, armed conflict is a significant vector, and sexual violence is the vehicle. What kind of impact? We know that Congo's has a fairly high rate of HIV occurrence. I think it's somewhere around 5%, and majority of those are women and girls. So I would imagine it's had quite an impact. I know the government's very conscious of the problem. It's been trying to work through it. Can you maybe just discuss a little bit about the impact that's had on communities, and what kind of measures have we taken to try to stop the transmission, cure those who have, or at least treat those who have it, and what can we do from here to help them?
I think part of the most important thing is recognizing it as a problem. So it's encouraging to hear you bring up the issue, which is very important. I think it also begs the broader question of how to provide effective health and medical services in DRC, which is of dire need, and possibly providing HIV care as part of more integrated health services. I know many NGOs do remarkable work providing health services in collaboration with the national government. HIV is especially interesting because I think there's actually broad recognition of the threat of the disease, and it can often create a rather perverse situation where people assume that survivors of sexual violence have AIDS. All of them. It's guaranteed and inevitable. And I think this definitely feeds into the stigmatization and ostracization of women who have been raped, which is unfortunate, since on one hand you want a recognition of HIV as a problem, but you also want people to recognize that it's not an inevitable outcome of rape. So I think there's a need to temper recognition with by providing services, but also realizing that we need to reduce the stigma around recognition of the fact that women and girls are susceptible to this. I think it's encouraging that the Congolese government is aware of the issue, and I think on the ground there needs to be a bit more attention to voluntary counseling and testing, prevention of mother-to-child transmission, and provision of antiretroviral therapy. So I think these are all important efforts that could actually be strengthened.
When it comes to, I really liked what you mentioned earlier about the idea of mental disarmament. I think that's probably, long term, that's probably the key. When it comes to girls especially, I would think that there's probably some challenges as far as being able to get them the services they need to mentally disarm, because there have been girl child soldiers as well as boys. So how is that going? And maybe we could bring it back also. I'm going to assume that some of these girls are also probably victims of sexual violence as well. So could you discuss a little bit about the impact of girls and how we're helping them reintegrate?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the vast majority, if not all, girls who have been associated with an armed group are probably victims of sexual violence or sexual slavery. We've interviewed a great number of female former child soldiers who note that the best possible outcome you can hope for is to belong to a commander who then protects you from other sexual predation. One of the challenges, I think, for women and girls leaving armed groups is that they face much more stigma than men. They're often looked upon as used goods. They don't get any of the even dubious honor of having tried to protect the country. They're not seen as real soldiers. They're often seen as just sexual playthings who are now tainted by their time associated with armed groups, even though some of the women and girls actually self-identified as having tried to become soldiers for a greater good. They don't really have any sense of belonging in communities. Many people think that they should go back to armed groups, or they don't have a place, they're not eligible for marriage, they're not seen as kind of fulfilling any kind of traditional female role. And one thing that women face as well is they often have children as a result of their time in armed groups. And these children often face, like their mothers, very, very intense stigma, this assumption that the children will grow up bad like their fathers, or are, already soldiers in some way, shape, or form cannot be trusted, should not be educated, should not be allowed to stay in relatives' houses, et cetera, et cetera. So addressing the stigma not only against former female soldiers and survivors of sexual violence, but their children as well is extraordinarily important. And that gets us back to these generational impacts of violence. Right now we see a generation of children who have been affected by or directly born from sexual violence, and if we don't take this up as an issue that is worthy to examine and address now, I think it's an issue that will clearly come to the fore in another generation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Toon. Well, thank you very much to our witness today for coming here and enlightening us. This will make it possible to have a more fulsome report than would otherwise have been possible. So I very much appreciate that, as do we all, I think. Colleagues, after we dismiss the witness, I have to ask you to stay here for a brief in-camera session. So if you could indulge us, we'll just suspend for a moment while we move to an in-camera session. Thank you very much.
It was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. We're suspended.